Mr. Allen Graves was a millionaire, but he did not look like one. He owned more than 100 stores across the country. He wore suits during meetings, flew in private jets, and lived in a beautiful house. But he was not proud or loud about his money. He believed in hard work and treating people with respect. One day, Allen sat in his big office looking at a report. One of his stores in a small town had very poor performance. Sales were low, customer complaints were high, and staff turnover was a problem. He had sent emails and asked the local manager for updates, but nothing changed. He felt something was wrong, but he did not want to send someone else to find out. He wanted to see it with his own eyes, so Allen made a plan. He decided to visit the store himself, but in disguise, he took off his watch, left his suit behind, and wore a plain shirt and jeans. He put on an old cap and used glasses he didn't need. He looked like an ordinary man looking for a job, not a millionaire CEO. He drove to the town in a simple car and walked into the store. The place looked dull, the lights were dim, shelves were messy, and the staff looked tired. Customers didn't smile, and some even argued near the checkout. Allen went to the back and asked to speak to the manager about a job. The manager, Mr. Curtis Dean, didn't even look at him properly. "We need someone in the stockroom," he said quickly. "Can you lift boxes?" Allen nodded. "Fine. Start tomorrow," Curtis said. "Minimum wage." "No benefits until 3 months," Allen didn't argue. He wanted to stay hidden. The next morning, Allen started his shift at 7 a.m. He wore a name tag that said Al. He stacked boxes, cleaned the back room, and helped on the floor when needed. He kept his head low and watched everything. It didn't take long to see the problems. The staff looked scared of Curtis. He shouted often, made rude comments, and ignored people who had ideas. He gave all the easy jobs to a few favorites, and the hard work to others. One employee caught Allen's attention. His name was Tyrone. He was a young black man, maybe in his early 20s. He worked as a cashier but also cleaned, organized shelves, and sometimes helped customers carry bags. He was polite, calm, and hardworking, but Curtis treated him badly. He often gave him short lunch breaks or yelled at him for small things. Allen noticed that Curtis never treated the white staff this way. It was clear that something unfair was happening. Allen felt angry inside, but he stayed quiet. He wanted to learn more before doing anything. During lunch breaks, Allen sat near Tyrone and talked. He said he was new in town and needed work. Tyrone smiled and shared a little about his life. He was working full-time to help his mother and younger sister. He also went to school in the evenings to study business. He said he loved people and wanted to one day open his own shop. Allen listened closely. Tyrone didn't complain, but Allen could see the pressure he carried. It was not easy to work under a manager like Curtis, but Tyrone still came to work on time, did his job, and smiled at customers. At the end of his first week, Allen wrote notes in a small notebook he kept hidden. He listed everything he saw, the way Curtis managed, how staff felt, and how Tyrone was treated. He made a decision. He would stay 1 more week and gather more information. Then he would reveal who he truly was, but for now, he was just Al, the quiet man in the stockroom. No one knew that the man lifting boxes had the power to change everything, and he was watching carefully. The sun had just started to rise when Allen walked into the store for his second week. He was still wearing his plain shirt, jeans, and the same old cap to the world. He looked like an ordinary worker, tired but on time. But inside, he was watching everything with sharp eyes. He was no ordinary man. He was the hidden owner of it all, from the very beginning. Allen noticed something strange about how the store felt. There was no laughter, no teamwork, no spirit. Everyone worked like machines, careful and quiet. They didn't speak much to each other unless they had to. And above all, they avoided the manager, Curtis Dean. Curtis ruled the store like a king, but a cruel one. He barked orders from behind the counter and rarely moved. He sat with his phone, scrolled through social media, and only stood up to criticize someone. He never helped, never encouraged, and never praised anyone's effort. Allen watched it all closely. Curtis seemed to have favorites, 3 or 4 staff members who got the easiest jobs. They worked slower than others, but still received compliments. Meanwhile, the hard-working employees were ignored. Or worse, insulted. Tyrone was always one of the targets. He was given the longest shifts and the hardest tasks. One day, the store got really busy, customers formed long lines at the cashier, and the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Tyrone was alone at the checkout. Trying to move quickly, he smiled, bagged items fast, and even helped an older lady carry her groceries to her car, but Curtis didn't notice any of that. Instead, he came out of the office yelling, "Why is this line moving so slow?" Tyrone calmly explained that 2 people had called in sick, and he was doing his best. Curtis rolled his eyes and said loud enough for customers to hear, "Maybe if you didn't waste time talking, you'd get something done." Tyrone looked down, embarrassed. No one said a word, not even the customers. Alan stood in the back, pretending to fix a shelf. But his fists were clenched later that day. Alan helped Tyrone in the break room. They sat together on crates, eating sandwiches. Alan asked, "Does he always talk to you like that?" Tyrone gave a small smile. "Yeah, but it's okay. I just focus on the work." Alan nodded slowly. Thinking hard each day, Alan learned more. He noticed how the other workers avoided Curtis's gaze. They feared making mistakes, not because they wanted to do better, but because they didn't want to be humiliated. Alan saw that Curtis never trained new employees properly. When someone failed at a task, he laughed at them instead of helping. That was not the kind of store Alan wanted in his company. On Wednesday, something strange happened. A woman came in with a returned item and asked for a refund. Tyrone followed store policy, but the woman became angry. She started yelling. Saying he was rude and didn't know what he was doing, Curtis rushed over. But instead of supporting Tyrone, he sided with the customer. "I'm sorry about this," Curtis said to her. "Some people just don't understand customer service." He looked straight at Tyrone as he said it. Tyrone stood quietly, his hands shaking slightly. Alan watched the entire thing from behind a display of canned soup, his heart heavy with anger, after the woman left. Curtis called Tyrone to the back office. He closed the door and raised his voice, blaming Tyrone for the store's poor reviews. Tyrone tried to explain, but Curtis interrupted him over and over. When Tyrone returned to the floor, his eyes were red, but he kept working. Alan made a note in his small notebook. This was the 3rd public insult in 2 days. By the end of the week, Alan had already seen more than enough. He knew the problem wasn't just poor sales or messy shelves, it was poor leadership. Curtis didn't care about the team, and that poison flowed into everything else. Customers could feel it, and employees lived in fear of it. But even in the middle of this darkness, Alan saw small lights. Like Tyrone's kindness to elderly customers, like the quiet cashier named Lila who stayed late to clean up without being asked, like the young stock boy Sam who smiled every time someone helped him, Alan knew what he had to do. He was going to reveal himself very soon, but first, he needed to see just one more thing: how far Curtis would go. Sometimes the truth shows itself when people think no one is watching, and Curtis still believed he was the one in control. Tyrone James arrived at the store every day before 7 a.m. He never complained, never came late, and never asked for special treatment. He wore the same clean blue uniform, kept his dreadlocks neat, and always greeted customers with a smile. But behind that smile was a young man carrying more than most people knew. Alan watched Tyrone closely over the next few days. There was something honest and steady about the way Tyrone moved. He didn't rush, but he worked fast. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words were polite and calm. He gave respect. Even when he didn't receive it, during one quiet afternoon, Alan and Tyrone ended up cleaning shelves in the same aisle. Alan picked up a few old cans and asked with a friendly tone, "How long you been working here?" Tyrone shrugged. "Almost 2 years now." "That long?" Alan asked, surprised. "Yeah," Tyrone said. "Started part-time during high school, stayed after graduation. You ever think about doing something else?" Alan asked carefully. Tyrone smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "All the time." They sat down on crates near the stockroom during break. Alan took small bites from his sandwich, trying to keep things casual. "You go to school too?" "Yeah," Tyrone said. "Community college, business major." He looked proud for a second, then added, "But I take only 2 classes a semester. Can't afford more." Alan nodded slowly. He didn't want to pry, but Tyrone opened up on his own. "My mom's sick," Tyrone said quietly. "She got hurt at her job a while ago. Now she can't work much." Alan listened without interrupting. "I got a little sister. She's 12, Tyrone said. "Smart kid. Wants to be a doctor someday." He smiled at the thought. "So I work here to keep things going at home." "Sounds like a lot," Alan said gently. "It is," Tyrone said. "But it's life." That night, Alan couldn't sleep. He sat in his small motel room and looked at the notes he'd written. Tyrone wasn't just a worker. He was a young man fighting hard to stay afloat. And still, He came in every day and gave his best. Meanwhile, Curtis Dean, the manager, treated him like he was nothing. Alan remembered something else, too. Tyrone had applied for a supervisor role 6 months ago. He was qualified, had the experience, and even trained new cashiers. But Curtis gave the job to someone else. Someone who had only been there for 3 weeks. When Tyrone asked about it, Curtis told him, "You're not leadership material." Alan thought about that phrase. What did Curtis mean by leadership material? From what Alan had seen, Tyrone had more leadership in his heart than Curtis ever would. Another employee, Lila, whispered to Alan one morning, "Tyrone should have been running this place by now." "He trained me when I started," she said. "Helped me not quit on my second day. Curtis just doesn't like him." That's all. Alan began to notice other things too. Tyrone always volunteered for the hardest shifts. He cleaned spills no one else wanted to touch. He stayed after hours to help fix a broken register, even though it wasn't his job. Customers remembered his name and smiled when they saw him. But Curtis never once said thank you. On Thursday, a teenage customer dropped a glass bottle of juice. It shattered near the checkout, and the girl froze in fear. Curtis shouted from across the store, "Someone better clean that mess before someone sues us." Without a word, Tyrone grabbed gloves, a mop, and cleaned everything. He even calmed the girl and told her, "It's okay. Accidents happen." The girl's mother later told Tyrone, "You've got a kind heart." Curtis didn't even notice Alan wrote all of this down. Page after page, every kind act, every insult ignored, every moment of grace under pressure. He was building a case not just against Curtis, but in support of Tyrone. Alan believed that stories like Tyrone's were the soul of his company. It wasn't the buildings or the logos or the profits. It was people like Tyrone, honest, hardworking, and humble, who kept things alive. Alan knew the moment was coming soon. He would reveal who he really was, and the truth would come out. But he also knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, Tyrone James deserved better than this, much better. It was Friday afternoon, and the store was packed, the weather outside was hot, and the air conditioning inside barely worked. Customers were already in a bad mood, pushing carts and arguing over prices. The phones rang nonstop, the shelves were half empty, and the staff was exhausted. Alan worked in the stockroom that morning. Quietly watching the tension grow, he could feel something building, a pressure in the air. Curtis, the manager, was already shouting by 10 a.m. "Move faster," he barked. "We're losing customers." But he didn't help. He just stood at the front counter, yelling orders and pointing fingers. Tyrone was on register duty again, alone. 2 other cashiers had called out sick, and Curtis didn't bother to call replacements. Tyrone handled everything by himself, scanning items, bagging them, answering questions, and even helping an old man who dropped his wallet. Still, the line kept growing. Alan walked past the front. Pretending to straighten a magazine rack, he saw sweat on Tyrone's forehead. His hands moving fast, his voice calm as ever. "Thank you for your patience," Tyrone said to a woman who looked ready to explode. But Curtis didn't notice any of that. All he saw was a long line. "What's taking so long?" Curtis snapped, stepping toward the front. Tyrone kept working. "I'm doing my best, sir. It's just me up here." Curtis raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you focused on the work instead of trying to look like a hero, maybe you'd move faster?" A silence fell over the store. Even customers paused, unsure what to say. Tyrone's face tightened, but he didn't respond. He just scanned the next item and handed the woman her change. Alan stood frozen near the magazines, his jaw clenched, his heart pounding. This was not just bad management. This was public humiliation. And it was directed at someone who had done nothing wrong. The next moment made everything worse. A woman in the line spoke up. "You don't need to yell at him like that," Curtis turned to her. "Mind your business, ma'am. This is store policy." "Then your store policy is broken," she replied sharply. Other customers murmured in agreement. Curtis's face turned red. "If you don't like it, you can shop somewhere else." Tyrone looked like he wanted to disappear. He lowered his eyes and kept scanning, trying to finish the line as fast as possible. Alan stepped back, his hands shaking slightly. He had seen enough. This was the breaking point. Not just for Tyrone, but for everyone watching later that day. Tyrone was called into the manager's office. Curtis closed the door and raised his voice again. "You embarrassed me in front of customers," he said. Tyrone tried to speak. "I didn't do anything wrong." You're always playing the victim," Curtis interrupted. Maybe this job isn't for you, he added coldly. Tyrone walked out of the office with his head down, his shoulders heavy. Alan followed him to the back room. You okay? He asked softly. Tyrone nodded once. Yeah, just tired. But Alan could see the hurt in his eyes. He had seen strong men break in smaller moments, yet Tyrone was still standing, still silent, still holding it in. That night, Alan went back to his motel and stared at the notebook in his hands. Page after page of notes about Curtis's behavior, about Tyrone's patience, about the staff's fear. This wasn't just a bad manager anymore. This was a man abusing his power, and that power had to be taken away. Alan opened his laptop and wrote a detailed email to the company's HR department. He didn't mention who he was, not yet, but he outlined everything he had seen. He also asked for a formal visit from the regional supervisor. It was time to make his move. But before that visit could happen, Alan wanted to do one last thing. He wanted to speak to more employees, to hear their stories. If Curtis was this cruel to Tyrone, maybe others had suffered in silence too. He needed the full truth the next morning. Alan came to the store before opening. He stood outside the building, watching the sunrise over the parking lot. He thought about all the people working inside. The ones who had no voice, no power, no one to defend them. That was about to change. Alan Graves was done hiding. The mask of Al the stockroom worker would come off soon. And when it did, everything in that store would be turned upside down. The next week began quietly, but Alan Graves was far from calm inside. He had watched enough, heard enough, and seen more than he ever expected, but he wasn't the kind of man to react in anger. He believed in truth, in fairness, and in solid proof. So instead of revealing himself, he made a new plan. He would start a quiet investigation from within. Alan arrived early Monday morning. Wearing the same cap and faded jeans to the staff, he was still Al, the quiet new guy who stayed out of trouble and worked hard. To Curtis, he was invisible, and that was exactly what Alan needed. He began by talking more with the employees one at a time, in the break room or out back near the loading dock, always with a friendly smile, always casual, never suspicious. He didn't ask too many questions, just let people talk, and once they started, the stories came pouring out. Lila, the cashier with tired eyes, told him that Curtis often cut her hours for no reason. He said I didn't smile enough, she whispered. But I think it's because I asked for a raise. Then there was Sam, a young stockboy who worked nights. He makes me unload trucks by myself, Sam said. Even though the rule is 2 people minimum, Alan asked. Have you reported it? Sam laughed. To who? Curtis reads all the complaints before anyone else sees them. By Tuesday, Alan had gathered 5 stories just like that. Stories of fear, unfair treatment, broken promises, and lost hope. Some workers said Curtis made fun of their accents. Others said he threatened to fire them if they spoke up. But the worst stories always involved Tyrone. He trains all the new hires, said Lila. He knows more about this store than Curtis ever will. Curtis just doesn't like that he's smarter, said another worker. He's jealous of Tyrone, that's the truth. Alan took notes every night in his motel room. He wrote down names, dates, and details. Everything. He knew he'd need every word when it came time to act. But Alan didn't stop there. He also tested the store's internal systems. He used the employee complaint form online and filled out a report under a fake name. In it, he described Curtis's behavior, the staff mistreatment, and the unsafe work conditions. Then he waited. 2 days later, nothing happened. No meeting, no follow-up, no email. Alan checked the manager's office and saw the report printed and left in the trash. Unread, untouched, ignored. That was the final confirmation. Curtis wasn't just a bad manager, he was covering his tracks, making sure complaints never reached corporate. He had turned the store into his own little kingdom, and no one had dared to challenge him. Until now, Alan took one more step. He contacted a friend at headquarters, someone he trusted, and asked them to quietly look into the store's records. Within hours, his friend called back. Alan, the voice said, you're not going to like what we found. Curtis had been claiming full staffing hours. But several workers said they were sent home early without pay. He had also marked customer complaints as resolved, even when nothing was done. Worse, he had been giving bonuses to himself under the name of fake Employee of the Month programs. It was fraud, plain and simple. Alan sat still for a moment after the call. He felt a mixture of disappointment and determination. He had built this company with the belief that respect and honesty mattered. And here was a man breaking every rule for power. He looked at his notebook again. So many names. So many stories, all depending on someone to listen. Now they had that someone. That evening, Alan met Tyrone again during closing. They mopped the front aisle together in silence for a while. Then Alan said softly, "You ever think of leaving?" Tyrone gave a small smile. "Every day," he said. "But I can't right now, too many people depending on me." Alan nodded. He already knew Tyrone wouldn't quit no matter how hard it got. He was loyal, and loyal people deserve better leaders. Alan made his final decision that night. He called the regional director and scheduled a surprise visit to the store. But this visit would be different. He would not arrive in jeans or wear his cap. He would walk through the front door in a suit. As himself, Alan Graves, CEO. The time for watching was over. The time for truth had come, and soon everyone in that store, especially Curtis, would see who had really been watching them all along. It was Thursday morning when the store opened like usual. Staff members walked in slowly, tired but ready for another long shift. Tyrone took his place behind the register, wiping the counter and checking the receipt paper. Curtis sat in the office sipping coffee, his feet up, scrolling through his phone. No one knew this day would be different. No one knew the man walking through the front doors at exactly 10 a.m. would change everything. Alan Graves stepped out of a black car and adjusted his suit jacket. He wasn't wearing his cap or work boots anymore. He wore polished shoes, a sharp blue tie, and a calm, serious face. He looked every bit the CEO he truly was, but in his heart, he still felt the same quiet fire. The fire that came from what he had seen over the last 2 weeks. He walked into the store, and right away, heads turned, customers paused. Staff looked confused, and Curtis, watching from behind the counter, stood up quickly. He had no idea who this man was, but something about him demanded respect. Alan walked to the center of the store and said, "Can I get all staff to the front, please?" His voice was clear and steady. Not loud, but strong enough to stop everything. Curtis rushed over, trying to take control. "Can I help you, sir? Are you with corporate?" Alan turned and smiled politely. Yes, you could say that. Within minutes, the employees gathered near the registers. Unsure what was happening, Tyrone stood near the back. Quietly watching, Curtis stood beside Alan, still trying to look important. Alan took a breath and looked around the room. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "My name is Alan Graves." A few workers gasped quietly. One woman dropped a pen. Tyrone's eyes widened, but he said nothing. "I am the founder and CEO of this company," Alan continued. "And for the past 2 weeks, I've been working right here in this store, as a stockroom employee." Now the silence was thick. Curtis's face turned pale. He stepped back slowly, opening his mouth. But no words came out. Alan raised the small notebook in his hand. "In this notebook, I've written down everything I saw," he said. "How the customers were treated, how the store was run, and most importantly, how all of you were treated as people." He turned toward the staff, looking each one in the eye. "I saw hard work. I saw kindness. I saw people doing their best even when it wasn't easy." He paused, then looked directly at Tyrone. "I saw a young man who led by example, stayed calm under pressure, and gave more than was ever asked of him." Tyrone blinked. Unsure what to say, his co-workers began to nod. Some even clapped quietly. Then Alan's face grew serious. "But I also saw something else," he said, turning toward Curtis. "I saw a manager who abused his power, ignored rules, and disrespected the very people who keep this store alive." Curtis tried to speak. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Alan held up a hand. Calm but firm, no misunderstanding, he said. "I have employee testimonies, complaint forms that were never sent, timesheet fraud, and customer service failures." He turned to the staff again. "You were not just ignored, you were silenced. And that ends today." A representative from HR entered the store and stood beside Alan. Curtis was asked to step aside immediately and hand over his store keys. "You are suspended pending full investigation," said the HR rep. Curtis didn't argue, didn't fight. He simply walked to the back room. Humiliated, Alan turned back to the staff. "I know many of you lost hope, and for that, I'm truly sorry," he said. "But starting today, things will be different." He walked over to Tyrone and extended his hand. "You've earned more than just respect," Alan said. "You've earned a leadership position." Tyrone looked stunned. "Me?" "Yes, Alan nodded. You've been leading this store without the title. Now it's time you had both. Tyrone shook his hand, still in shock. Alan added, We'll also be providing you with a scholarship to help finish your business degree. The staff burst into applause, and for the first time in a long while, the store felt alive again. Alan didn't stop there. He announced new policies, anonymous reporting, mental health support, fair scheduling, and monthly staff meetings led by employee feedback. This company was built to serve people, not just profits, he said. And we'll return to that starting now. He stayed for another hour, speaking to every employee, listening, thanking them. Then he shook Tyrone's hand one more time and said, I'll be back. Maybe in uniform again. Tyrone laughed quietly. You had us all fooled, sir, Alan smiled. Sometimes, you see the truth better when no one knows who you are, and with that, he walked out the door, not just as a CEO, but as a man who chose to lead by example. The store felt like a new place the very next morning. The air was lighter, the staff walked taller, and even the customers noticed something had changed. There were smiles at the register, laughter in the aisles, and conversations that weren't whispered anymore. The dark cloud that once hung over everything had lifted. Curtis Dean, the former manager, was gone. He had been removed the day before. Escorted out by HR, no yelling, no second chances, just silence as he packed his things, and for the first time in a long while, the staff could breathe. Tyrone arrived early. But not as a cashier anymore. He wore a new badge with a new title, assistant manager. His shirt was pressed, his shoulders straight, but his heart still beat fast. He had never asked for power, but now he had it. And he was ready to use it the right way. The store's regional supervisor, Ms. Dana Brooks, came in to support the transition. She gathered the staff in the break room, offered clear instructions, and introduced new policies. We're not just fixing this store, she said. We're setting a new example. Tyrone stood beside her as she spoke. It felt strange to be up front, where Curtis used to stand. But the difference was clear. Tyrone earned his place. And no one questioned it after the meeting. One of the newer workers, a shy girl named Mia, walked up to him. Congratulations, she said softly. You deserve this, Tyrone smiled. Thanks, he said. Now let's make this a place we can all be proud of. Alan Graves had flown back to the city, but his presence remained. Posters went up near the staff entrance showing a message from him. Every voice matters. Every job is important. Every person deserves respect. The staff read those words every day before clocking in, and they believed them. Meanwhile, HR completed their full investigation on Curtis. It didn't take long to confirm what Alan had already uncovered. Fake timesheets, bonus fraud, ignored complaints, and patterns of discrimination. Curtis's employment was officially terminated, and legal action was considered. He wouldn't be working in retail again anytime soon. But Alan didn't just want punishment, he wanted progress. So he launched a new internal program across all stores, Project Ground Level. It allowed any employee to submit concerns directly to a private review team. It also created leadership pathways for workers like Tyrone, who showed integrity under pressure. Tyrone, now in his new role, didn't waste time. His first move was to change how shifts were assigned. He created a rotation that was fair and open, so no one got stuck with all the worst hours. He also made a schedule where every employee had at least one weekend off a month. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He cleaned up the break room too, bought a few small plants, organized the fridge, and pinned up a shout-out board. Each week, staff could write notes praising co-workers, simple messages like, "Thanks for helping yesterday," or "Great job handling that tough customer." By the end of the first week, the board was full. Customers noticed the change as well. They saw faster service, cleaner aisles, and friendlier staff. One regular shopper even said, "I don't know what happened here, but it feels like a real store now." Sales slowly began to rise, not because of discounts or flashy signs, but because people enjoyed being there. The store had become a place of dignity again. Alan checked in by phone every few days. He spoke with Tyrone, asked how things were going, and offered support. "You're doing great," Alan said. "Just remember, leadership isn't about power. It's about people." Tyrone took those words seriously. He didn't raise his voice or act like a boss. Instead, he listened, helped, and led by example. He even went back to school with the scholarship Alan had promised. 2 nights a week after work, he attended business classes. He sat in the front row, took notes, and dreamed of one day opening a store of his own. But for now, he had a mission. He wanted this store to succeed, not just for the customers, but for the team that stayed through the worst times. He wanted Mia, Sam, Lila, and the others to believe in their jobs again. One afternoon, while helping a customer carry bags to her car, Tyrone paused and looked back at the store. He saw Mia smiling at the register, Sam organizing a shelf with pride, and the break room door open with laughter inside. It was a simple scene, nothing dramatic, but to Tyrone, it meant everything. Justice had been served. Not just by removing Curtis, but by restoring respect, giving hope, and building something better. And for the first time in a long while, Tyrone felt not just proud, he felt at peace. 3 months had passed since Alan Graves revealed his true identity. Since then, the store had gone through a quiet but powerful transformation. Not because of new signs or big speeches, but because of small, honest changes. Changes that started with people who cared. Tyrone stood at the front of the store on a Monday morning. Clipboard in hand, he checked the schedules, smiled at the staff arriving, and made sure everyone had what they needed. The old fear was gone. No more walking on eggshells. No more fake smiles. Now there was laughter in the aisles. Real teamwork in the back room and mutual respect everywhere. Customers could feel it too. They stayed longer, shopped more, and spoke kindly to the staff. One elderly man came in just to say, "This place feels good now." A mother of 3 told Lila, "I used to dread shopping here. Now I look forward to it." The sales numbers confirmed it. Profits were up, complaints were down, but those numbers didn't matter as much as the energy in the building. For the first time in years, people looked forward to coming to work. Tyrone had become more than just a manager. He was a mentor, a leader, a listener. When Sam made a mistake with inventory, Tyrone didn't yell. He said, "Let's fix it together." When Mia asked for help handling a difficult customer, he stood beside her and guided her through it. Every Friday, Tyrone held a short team huddle. They discussed wins, shared ideas, and gave shout-outs. At the end, he always said the same words, "We're not just a team. We're a family." In the break room, the shout-out board overflowed with notes. "Thanks for covering my shift. You made that customer smile. Great work on the display." These messages reminded everyone that their efforts were seen and appreciated. Alan Graves continued checking in, sometimes through emails, sometimes with surprise visits, but now when he entered the store, he didn't have to wear a disguise. He walked through the doors with pride, greeted by waves and smiles, and he always asked the same question. "How are you really doing?" He didn't just care about sales, he cared about people, and that belief became the store's heartbeat. Tyrone also continued his night classes. After long days of managing, he sat in college classrooms with a notebook in hand. His dream of opening his own store one day hadn't faded. It had grown stronger. But for now, he was focused on building something special right where he was. One evening, Alan invited Tyrone to a company dinner in the city. It was a formal event. Managers, executives, and directors all in one place. Tyrone wore a borrowed suit and stood quietly in the corner at first. But when Alan introduced him as the reason we're rewriting our leadership program, the whole room applauded. Alan spoke on stage that night, telling the story of how he went undercover. He spoke of fear, unfairness, and silence, and how it was broken by truth and action. He ended his speech with a message that stayed in every heart. "We found gold in a young man who was nearly crushed by a broken system. And now, we build forward, with heart, with honesty, and with people like Tyrone leading the way." Back at the store, changes continued. New employees were trained differently, not with cold rules, but with warmth and guidance. Tyrone created a buddy system, pairing each new hire with someone experienced. That way, no one felt alone on their first day. The store also started a community day once a month. On that day, staff volunteered at local schools, parks or food banks. It wasn't required, but almost everyone joined. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was a purpose. One morning, as Tyrone walked through the store, he saw something that made him stop. Mia was helping an elderly woman pick out canned goods. Sam was joking with a young boy in the toy aisle, and Lila was teaching a new cashier how to use the scanner. There was no shouting, no tension, no fear, just people doing their best. Together, Tyrone smiled to himself and took a deep breath. This store, once broken and cold, had become something beautiful. And it had started with a man in disguise, a notebook and a quiet cashier who never gave up. He didn't know what the future held. Maybe one day he'd run his own business. Maybe he'd become a district manager, but no matter where life led him, he would never forget this journey. Because here, in this simple store, justice had been served, dignity had been restored, and something true had been built. A store transformed,